Welcome to Life and Teachings of Jesus at Life Ministry Institute here in Sequim, KingsWay. I'm Pastor Daryl Morris, and I've been teaching this course all over the world actually. I can remember teaching it in Cuba and in Mexico, of course, where we were missionaries for many years, and even over in Indonesia. And it's always been something that inspires people to study the Gospels more and to be better followers of Jesus. And so we're going to be studying the four Gospels in this class and how they present Jesus, what they have in common, and then also the distinctives of each Gospel. I find that learning about the different ways that the Gospels present Jesus is a good help to us to know which Gospel to turn to in a given situation, especially in a missions context or an evangelism context where you're sharing with people that are coming from a certain background. There's certain stories in the Gospels that will really speak to their hearts if we know that that's where they're coming from. So we'll go over the syllabus. It's the first page in your notebook. You should have a notebook like this. And on the first page it is the syllabus. It says Life and Teachings of Jesus and Objectives. And this is what we're really aiming for in this class. Understanding the works and the teachings of Jesus. Now, when I say works, I mean the miracles he did and the deeds, the things that he did for others and to others that are meant to teach something about his identity and his person, whether it be multiplying bread and fish in the desert or whatever. And the teachings of Jesus, which are the red parts, where if you have the words of Jesus in ink and red ink in your Bible, the teachings of Jesus, what he taught, and how that gave us a better understanding what God was teaching all along and fulfilled those teachings in the Old Testament, as revealed in the four Gospels, to be better able to follow his example and instruction as disciples of Jesus. Now, Jesus didn't lead a good life just so we could follow his example. We see the theology that he led a good life in our place, and in Israel's place, and in our place, in the sense that he was the one that lived a righteous life so he could die for us and pay for our sins. So it's not just following his example as a good person, but following his example as a revelation of God's character in a human being that we can live by. And then the second objective there is understand who Jesus is. Hey Chris, welcome. We want to, in the second objective, we want to understand who Jesus Christ is by learning to distinguish the viewpoints, the emphases, and the presentation of the person of Jesus in each of the four Gospels. God is the one who inspired the writers of the Gospels in those different ways. And so we want to see what God has to say to us about the person of Jesus, so we can relate correctly to him and teach also others what they reveal about him. Now, it's all about Jesus when you get down to it. And just a quick review: that understand the works and teachings of Jesus as revealed in the four Gospels, to be able to better follow his example and instructions as disciples of Jesus. And so that's what this class is for. It's not a theology class, but we'll talk about some theology. And it's not a literature course, a New Testament literature course, but we will look closely at the literature because it's through the literature that God presents this to us. And I have a place there, it says personal objective. Objective. It's been translated from Spanish, so there's going to be some of those in there. Think about what your own personal objective or what your goal for this class might be. You're free to write that in, and then in the question and answer time, find out the answer to those questions that you have about the Gospels or about Jesus. And so the elements of the course are pretty clear there. There's attendance, 5 Fridays, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. It says 7 to 9 p.m. You can correct that. There's pens on the table there if you need to correct that. and just listen, take notes, participate in the discussion and the class activities. I'll have about a 30-40 minute presentation with PowerPoint and with diagrams on the board and such. And then we'll have a question and answer time, and we'll see how much of that we can include in the videos that will be helpful to others. And so for homework, you have this workbook. I'll probably give you some questions at the end that you can write in there and be answering during the week. And also each week we will read one of the Gospels. So starting tomorrow, you can read the Gospel of Matthew. It's in biblical order, and try and read through it. It's about four or five chapters to be able to read through it a day, to be able to read through it before class next Friday. So we'll be reading through all four Gospels in the next 5 weeks, and taking a closer look next week at Matthew, and that's why we'll read it in that order. And then just as a way to evaluate and see how much you've learned, we'll have an opportunity to do a presentation of topics in the Gospels, 5-10 minute teaching, because we're not, part of the objectives you can see up there is to be able to teach what the Gospels reveal about Christ. It's not just have the knowledge in our head or just for me to be a good follower, but it's, Jesus said, part of the Great Commission is to teach them all the things that I have commanded you. So you'll have an opportunity there to do a short teaching on a topic of your interest, and you can talk with me on that, and turn in a little bit of a teaching outline. Minimum 5 scriptures. They should all be from the Gospels, and you can use all 4 of the Gospels, or you can focus on 1 or 2 of the Gospels and a theme in one of those. And then we have a little quiz further along. We may have a quiz just next week, just a kind of a test quiz. A test quiz? Can you have a test quiz? Just wanted to see, hey, how much do we already know, and how much do we have to learn? And then it's just going to be on distinctive points of the 4 Gospels: the author, purpose, emphasis. So I'll mention one of the emphases of a Gospel, and by the time you finish the presentation today, the class today, you should be able to say, oh, you know, which one has the most emphasis on the Old Testament and quotes the Old Testament the most directly. Oh, that's going to be Matthew, and so on. Or which one has the 7 I ams? I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the true vine. Oh, that'll be John. So we'll be looking at that. And then on the next page, where it says Life and Teachings of Jesus, this is just a couple paragraphs on why we're studying it this way. When Jesus wrote no documents. And I think maybe it was you, James, that you mentioned that to me the other day.
Right.
Yeah, you said, well, Jesus himself didn't write any documents. And it's probably good, because they'd be worshiping the documents, the pieces of paper, like they do pieces of the cross and stuff like that, and instead of reading and obeying and understanding them. But he did inspire 4 different authors to write the Gospels that we have, and present the works and the words of Jesus. And the purpose, why we got to ask ourselves, why did disciples of Jesus, or even other people like Luke and Mark, who weren't direct disciples or apostles of Jesus, why did they write things down later? What was their purpose? And in general, we can sum up, it's so that people could continue serving that Jesus better, and living for that Jesus, and following him as disciples. Each one presents distinct viewpoints, emphases, and applications of Jesus' story to their context, whether it be traditional religious context, like the Jewish people that Matthew speaks to, or a people downbeaten and under persecution, like Mark's gospel speaks to persecuted Roman Christians, or people that are well educated and perhaps well off, and they are seeing a huge impact on their lives with the gospel, like Luke addresses. So there's different aspects like that. But as the Word of God, each gospel tells us who Jesus is in order to relate to Jesus correctly in our contexts and to teach what they reveal about him to others. And we'll begin with what, like I said, the general historical context of the Gospels and the times of Jesus and the authors and what they were facing. And then we'll see what a gospel is as literature. And then over the next 4 weeks after this, we'll dive into some of the teachings of Jesus after we look at each individual gospel in depth. There's a question there at the start of the last paragraph. It says, what are the main events of the life and ministry of Jesus? Now, if you had to write a gospel, or if you had to say, what are the top 5 events, or top 10 events even, of Jesus' life from what you know from the Bible and the Gospels, which ones would you include if you could only include a few? It's kind of helps you to see Jesus did a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of things, but each author focused on certain ones, and some are repeated in the different Gospels. Or what are the main teachings of Jesus? This is what we're getting at in this class. To be able to say, hey, these are the things that are really important that we know that Jesus did, and what they reveal about him as a person. And what are the teachings of Jesus? What are the distinctive message of each gospel? And what is the relationship between the 4 gospels? So that we're not going, hey, which one is lying? This guy says there's two blind men, and this one says there's just one, and they're mixed up. No, what was the purpose? And see the purpose in the inspired text to point out different details. So, as we explore these questions, the last sentence is there on this page, we must remember our purpose is to follow Jesus' example, his teachings, and his person. And it's most about, I didn't want to put mostly because I didn't want to weaken it with the mostly. It's most and maybe all about our relationship with the Son of God proclaimed in these texts. So, let each encounter with Jesus in the text be an encounter with Jesus in your heart and mind. So that's what we're going to go over in this class. And I'm going to just go ahead and start off with our first slide that talks about what we're going to be looking at. It's a study of the 4 Gospels to know Christ better, to follow him better. That's just kind of a review of our objectives there. But why do I emphasize this so much? Because I want you to ask questions along the lines of how do we live that out, or how should we, and the interpretation of what's written in the Gospels. That's really what we're getting at. So not just to know the names of the 12 apostles by memorize them. And so first we're going to do an introduction to the Gospels as literature in their time. And we need to look at the historical scene, and there's several aspects to this. And each one of these points is, whatever's written up here is on your notebook there. And so you can write notes in between those. The Roman Empire had conquered the area and ruled before the time of Jesus, just before, and sometime after, many hundreds of years after, in that area where Jesus and the apostles were. So it was a Roman Empire, and there's a lot of history there. And the religious scene was the Jews and the Jewish religion as lived in the first century. And they had what we have as the Old Testament. That was their Bible. They had a temple in Jerusalem. It was rebuilt. It was rebuilt after the destruction of the temple in the Old Testament. And they were exiled to Babylon. They came back, and they rebuilt Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple and the altar, and that was destroyed again or let run down again, and then rebuilt by Herod the Great, and he wasn't even full Jewish. His mother was Jewish, but he was from an Edomite or Idumean.
Herod?
But Herod, yeah. And he ruled over the Jews because he made a good arrangement with the Romans. He said, I'll keep them in line. And they said, okay, you kind of rule over them, but he kind of shared that rule with the governor, who was Pilate. And we got to remember too, the culture was different back then. It's the Middle East. It's a different kind of bread, a different kind of tables, houses with flat roofs, where you did a lot of work on top of the roof. There's a lot of that cultural difference that we need to take into account when we're thinking, how does this apply, and what we're looking at. One good way to remember the setup for the New Testament and for the coming of the good news of Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God is to look at Daniel 2, verses 31 to 45, where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And he dreams of this great idol with a golden head and a silver arms and shoulders and torso, a bronze waist, and iron legs, and then clay mixed with iron in his feet. And so he has this dream, and he's disturbed, and he's going to kill all the wise people of Babylon if they don't tell him what he dreamed and what it means. So Daniel, and God reveals to Daniel what it is, and that the head of gold is the Babylonian Empire that Nebuchadnezzar is ruling, and that we put 587 BC because that's when they destroyed Jerusalem and took over and ruled over that area. But the Medo-Persians, or the Medes and the Persians, they were kind of a mixed culture. In 539, they conquered the Babylonians, and they sent, a year later, they sent back the Jews back to their home to rebuild their temple. And so there was the influence of that empire, the Persian, like Darius and Artaxerxes and those. This is going on in between the Testaments. 330 BC, the Greeks with Alexander the Great conquered that whole area. And so that was the bronze. And the Greeks really, kind of back up here, the Greeks really imposed their language and culture on everyone, and they had everybody speak in the same language in the whole empire, even up to and through Jesus' day. And that made it, that was God's way of using what man does to prepare to spread the gospel, because all our manuscripts of New Testament documents are all Greek manuscripts. They're written in Greek. Some might have been written parts in Aramaic or something like that before, but as they were passed down to the church and through all the Gentiles, beyond just the Jews, once it became Christian literature, it was all in Greek, and it could circulate widely and be read widely, which is a benefit. And then the Romans, in 63 BC, the General Pompey conquered Jerusalem and took over that area for the Romans, brought it under the Roman Empire. And part of what the Romans did was establish the Pax Romana. They controlled everything, got everything under control, and they set up these roads, these highways, where people could commerce, and people started traveling back and forth, and even the Jewish people were able to return to Jerusalem easier on pilgrimages, and people like Barnabas could have land on Cyprus and then still be in Jerusalem and decide, hey, I'm going to sell this land and give it to the poor. And those kinds of things made it so that the gospel could be communicated not just linguistically with the Greek, but also with all the Roman roads. Paul's journeys followed, the Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys, they followed those Roman roads. And so he got to Rome, and then he was talking about going to Spain. In the book of Romans, he's talking about going beyond them to Spain, to where those roads led. And so the Romans really, in establishing their empire, they made it easier to evangelize. And then the clay mixed with iron, about 47 BC, is when Herod the Great, worked a deal with Pilate. And I'm not even sure about this. It may be the Hasmoneans were the Jews. There was a brief period in here where the Jewish leadership and priestly peoples, they attained their independence. And so there's some influence there. And the Sadducees kind of came out of that movement. And so, but it's to understand when we get to the Gospels and they talk about these different peoples, and we're going like, well, who's this? Herod and Pilate had to work together because Herod, he had some sway with the Romans, and he said, I'll take care of these, but it still had to be under Roman law. And so that's why Herod sent Jesus to Pilate to have him crucified. And Pilate was, well, he hasn't broken any Roman law, but well, he had broken they accused him of breaking the Jewish law.
So now Herod and Pilate were 47 BC?
No. What I'll say Herod was, Pilate was after. Pilate was in Jesus' time, in the latter years. Pilate wasn't there before, but Pilate represents the Roman governorship. Yeah, that's a good clarification to make. Herod was from about 47 all the way up to 6 or 4 BC. Probably about 4 BC is when he died.
When was Christ born?
He was born 4 to 6 BC. Yeah, that's the crazy thing. We're gonna look at the timeline.
Okay, sorry.
We do have that on a timeline, but
I would never answer that. Be able to answer that
you'd
question.
think he was born in the year 1,
right?
AD, but he was actually, and he would have been if 400 years later, when they figured out the calendar, they had got it a little more accurately. But that was because they didn't establish it in that year. It was years later. And a lot of people said that, oh no, the archaeology doesn't show that things were happening at that time. But Herod was around at that time, and actually they have archaeological finds that talk about Pilate in that region. And when they said that no, he didn't exist, he was just made up. So archaeology just continues. They continue to find actual physical evidence of the historical facts that are in the Bible. The important thing, though, is to realize that the Jewish king wasn't really a descendant of David, Herod, and he had 4 sons that also were they were not really Jewish. They were the Herods of Jesus' adult life.
So who was Jewish now?
Jesus.
Herod the Great's mother
Was Jewish.
Yeah. And he was Idumean, or from Edom, which didn't exist anymore as Edom in those days. So that's the idea is that he kind of like through his mother's Jewishness, he said, "Oh, I can be king of the Jews," but he wasn't really a descendant of David. He wasn't legally on the throne, but he had leverage back in Rome. He knew how to work the politics. And so this was a political arrangement, and by the time of Jesus, his crucifixion, that Herod was a son of Herod the Great, and Pilate was the governor of that time from about 26 on, and so through Jesus' time. But that began, 47 BC began Herod's reign in there underneath the iron of the Romans. So anyway, so it's very complex political situation. and there's all these balances and keeping things under control. And then you have Jesus entering, and in the passage in Daniel, it talks about a stone was cut from the mountain, and then it crushed and pulverized everything. And well, that's the eternal kingdom. That's the stone cut from the mountain. That's Jesus who broke into that. We need to remember that it was the Medo-Persians that returned the Jews to the land 500 years before. The Greeks established their language and culture across a large part of the world, 330 BC. This is not mentioned in the previous dream of Nebuchadnezzar, but the Hasmoneans attained Jewish independence for a time, between 142-ish and 63. As far as I can see on the timeline, it's right up to when Pompey conquered Jerusalem. And so the Hasmoneans were kind of a priestly group that fought for the independence, and out of them were the Sadducees, who still had some involvement with the priestly people. They weren't priests themselves, but it was more of a political bent that worked with the Romans because they wanted to maintain the status quo. And then, but the Romans were the ones that governed in the time of Jesus. A lot of this we know from just years of being in Sunday school or going to church or seeing even movies or representations. You got the Roman soldier with the big,
Yeah, correct. The Romans were throughout Jesus' time on earth, were in government.
Yeah. They were governed over the local governments of the Jews in Jesus' time. And then other aspects, historically, we got to remember that there are others that we've heard about, the Pharisees. You guys are looking at your notes, so it's probably easy to see, but look ahead. What are some of the other sects or groups? You might call them denominations among the Jews. Some of them were more political in their bent, some of them were more religious in their bent. And then some of them, as a religion, they kind of aligned politically. So we have the Pharisees and the scribes. We have the Sadducees that I was just mentioning, the Herodians, which I just recently learned. I always identified the Herodians with the Sadducees. I thought it was just another name. But actually, they're probably a group more politically aligned with Herod, and not the Sadducees. Then there were the Zealots or the Canaanians. One of the apostles was Simon the Zealot, or the Canaanian in another gospel. And then they're in the last two, or the last group, it's not mentioned in Scripture, but it was functioning at that time. We know about it from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran community, and there was a group of the Essenes. Some people think that John the Baptist or even Christianity had its roots in the Essene movement. They were kind of like hyper Pharisees, and they had their own writings, and they had ritual washings that was a lot like baptism and things like that people see that there's influences. But it's more about there's other stuff going on, and these aren't mentioned per se in the Scripture, but we know that they were going on at the same time. We read in Josephus and other historians. But it does mention the Zealots, who were the nationalists. They wanted Rome out. So they wanted Rome out. They wanted to rule themselves. They wanted to go back to like a Hasmonean rule. The Herodians were aligned with Herod. They thought that they should be their own nation, but they supported Herod. And the Sadducees were more it's interesting studying the Sadducees. They control the Sanhedrin, the governing body, and they had religious beliefs that were contrasted with the Pharisees in the Gospels. and that's where it presents most of our information. The scribes were also called lawyers. Well, we can just go through these here. Lawyers or interpreters of the law or something like that. So the Pharisees, the roots of the movement began 200 years before Christ, with a lot of these, with the Hasidim, the righteous ones. They accepted the Torah or the Pentateuch as equally inspired, and the oral traditional material. They would accept the writings and the prophets, but also a lot of their oral tradition of decisions and interpretations. And they believed in a balance between the free will of man and the sovereign will of God. And what we know, a lot of it, is from Josephus, and he was talking, and he discusses the Pharisees and the Sadducees in relation to how do you account for sin. God, it's not God's will that people sin, but they sin anyway. So they believed in a sovereign will of God, but within that, man had a free will. There's some that are mentioned in the Bible that they believe in a developed hierarchy of angels and demons. They taught a future existence for the dead. There was a reward for the good and punishment for the unrighteous. And they believed in the immortality of the soul, that there'd be reward or punishment after death. I think we have one more on them. Yeah, there's a lot of information. They supported human equality. Everyone's the same before God. And their emphasis, this is one that sticks out to me, their emphasis was more ethical than theological. We might think of a Pharisee as someone who theologized, was a philosopher type. But they're very practical. And so his ethic is about the application of what they did to make sure that they lined up with the Old Testament law. The scribes, they began in Ezra's time, 450 BC, among the priests. And later, kind of in separate guilds maybe, there's some scribes, a scribal clan mentioned in 1 Chronicles that may be a reflection of that. They were the ones that established the synagogue service, the tradition of the elders mentioned in Mark 7 and Matthew 15, where, why don't your disciples keep the tradition of the elders? It was this body of interpretation and application of the law that they took on an equal level with it. And so they had their commentaries that were just as important to them. And they sat in the Sanhedrin. They helped the Sadducees. The elders would be made up of the Sadducees, some of the Pharisees. The scribes would be there to check, is that what the word says, or what the judgments have been. They're specialists in studying the law of Moses, and they're also called lawyers or teachers of the law. It's interesting that Luke is the one that avoids the word scribe, because the word used for scribe has a meaning of like a bureaucratic office in Greek that Luke was using. And Luke mentions a lot of officials, Roman officials and city officials. And so he's very careful to make sure they don't think the grammateus, the scribes, were like civil servants, but that they were religious ones. So he calls them lawyers or teachers of the law. Which in our language, lawyer, you don't think of the lawyer as even a civil servant, but you don't think of him as a religious person. They would be dogmatists. The Sadducees was the party, and they were in control of the Sanhedrin, and they began in the period of the Hasmoneans. They did not hold as inspired or authoritative the traditional oral law. Just the 5 books of Moses was inspired for them. They're politically aligned with the Roman rule. The Sadducees were very rigid about the Levitical purity, and which is odd because they really weren't They really weren't the priestly line. They weren't all Levites themselves. They attributed everything to the free will of man. Anything bad happens is because man has totally free will. And they didn't believe in a resurrection or a future for the dead. Jesus corrected them on that because they ignore the scriptures and the power of God, he said. When they asked him a trick question about a resurrection, Jesus answered them that, there won't be marriage and giving in marriage and things going on like that. They'll be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection, he did correct them because they didn't believe in that. They did not believe in angels or demons, and they rejected the idea of a spiritual world. Only the law of Moses is Holy Scripture and inspired. So those are the different groups that you will encounter as you read, and you always have. The Sadducees, they're sad, you see, and the Pharisees, they're not fair, you see. So we kind of grow up with that Sunday school idea of them, but we really need to see what's going on, the dynamic of a situation that we're reading about. We need to know where their influence is coming from, and how significant is it that the Pharisees came together with the Herodians to destroy Jesus. They, got together. How significant is that people from such different leanings, religious or political, got together? So real quick, on the back of your notebook, there are some diagrams, and there's a timeline, just so you don't worry about the timeline one. What you see here is a chronology, but you can watch it on the screen as it develops. So 1 AD there's no year 0.
Right.
So it's the span of a year. 1 AD is up there, but Jesus was probably born between 6 and 4 BC, because we have a historical date when when Herod died, and that tells us, that it was he killed all the children 2 years and younger. In Matthew 2, it tells us about that. So, we're not too concerned about like exact dates and whether down to the month and everything, but things generally fit. Then we get the idea that this was significant, and then he died right after he did something like that. The visit of the Magi was sometime within the first year or two after his birth. And then we have the one childhood moment of Jesus in Luke chapter 2, where he's 12 years old with Jesus in the temple. He separates from his parents. They go walking home back to Galilee and go, wait, where's Jesus? And they go all the way back to the temple and find him there. And didn't you know I'd be about the business of my Father? And so the 12-year-old Jesus, conscious of who he is in that sense. And of course, Luke also reveals a bunch of things about the birth of Jesus and around this time. But just so you can see, that's 25 years there. And then in the next 25 years, John the Baptist begins his ministry probably about 26 BC, maybe 27, 28. And right after that, he's not preaching for long when Jesus begins his ministry. And then Jesus celebrates first Passover. That's one of the dates in the year 30 that we can kind of nail down. And he ministered for 3 years. He ministered for 3 years, basically a 3-year period of ministry, and then his death and resurrection probably in the year 33, 30 to 33. It just depends on calendar dates that we don't have fixed as far as what year the Passover was celebrated on the first day of the week. And then we have the book of Acts taking place in all these years, and then Saul's conversion some years later. Saul, who became Paul the missionary, towards year 40. This is not like an exact numbers thing. It's like 5-year increments, and it's just to give you an idea of the spread over 100 years of the Gospels. So Peter probably died in 64 under Nero, and Mark wrote, maybe he wrote before, maybe he wrote back in 60. But Mark writes, and we're going to see a little bit later what the evidence is, as Peter remembered and as Peter preached the gospel. Luke wrote somewhere in there. Probably he also wrote the book of Acts. And at the end of the book of Acts, it says Paul was 2 years in Rome and sharing the gospel. And so that would place it towards the year 66 to 68. As the soonest he could have done that, but it could have been sometime after. The year 70 is important because in the year 70 the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple again, and there are parts of the Gospels where Jesus predicts this, and if you don't believe, like some Bible scholars don't believe in prophecy, then they think that it was written after reading that into Jesus' prophecies and such. But that we don't use that as a way of establishing when it was written. And I just put Matthew at 75. It could have been 68, it could have been earlier, but it's somewhere in this earlier part. And then we had a great persecution under Domitian. And John writes, I put it in 87, but it could have been all the way up to 96. And then John wrote, or died probably in the year 98. And so it was, there's different traditions and such. But just so you get a scope of over a century, that the Gospels were not written right in the time of Jesus. They weren't necessary because the people were alive preaching these things. And then as those people passed on, it was necessary to write them down as they preached them.
How do we know, like when Matthew wrote?
How do we know? We don't know exactly.
To me, it doesn't make sense that he wouldn't have written either while he was with Christ or as soon as Christ died. Oh my gosh, we got to write this down.
There would have,
why would he wait? I mean, he would have to wait, 25, 30 years before he starts writing.
I think
that doesn't make sense. I mean,
but because we don't memorize things and pass things along in an oral tradition, and that's what. That it kind of explains why the Synoptic Gospels are so similar, because there was a regular tradition that they all taught these things, and there's little changes in them. But part of that is there might have been some written documents of those different instances or parts of it, but as a book to compile it, it was probably further along when he realized that this needs to be written down for this purpose. And for instance, Matthew. Why? Because he was teaching and everybody was going and evangelizing, but later on, Matthew says, the Jews are sitting on their hands, the Jewish Christians are waiting for all the rest of the Jews to come to Christ, but we have a command from Jesus. I need to show these Jewish believers that Jesus is the Messiah, and he says get up and go out and preach to all nations. And so he wrote his gospel. He wrote down the things that had already, maybe Mark had already written his, and he said, okay, yeah, that's what we taught. But I want to focus on, this is the fulfillment. They have plenty of evidence to know that Jesus is the Christ. We need to move on. And that explains why he begins with a genealogy going back to Abraham. That explains why his emphasis on the law and the prophets and all the proofs that Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament in Matthew, and the emphasis on go and make disciples of all nations at the end. And so that's part of what we're going to emphasize. Because that situation called for a writing of a certain way of that gospel. And then Mark, we can look at Mark was writing down the things that Peter preached, but he put them all together in his gospel once Peter was getting close to death, or right soon after his death. And we'll show the evidence why Mark was close to Peter at the end. 1 Peter 5:13, he says Mark is with me, and there's other things in the book of Acts that gives us kind of the outline of the Gospels that shows, hey, this is how Peter preached, this is how the apostles preached, the things they included. So you would think, because we write things down, I write things down as soon as someone tells me, or I tell Siri to make me a reminder. But they didn't have smartphones in Jesus' time. We have to realize this. So yeah, they memorized stuff. They memorized stuff. Then they realized, hey, we don't want this getting changed. There were heresies. That's part of the reason of the canon, also, of collecting the inspired writings and saying these are the inspired writings. These are the ones that have impacted the church and have the truth. Because there were heresies that were saying, no, this no, that no, this yes, wait a minute, that's wacko stuff. So that's part of it. And that's where God inspired the writers, and that's where you think John would have waited a little bit less. But because of what was happening in the last part of the first century, and people were saying that Jesus was just like a superhuman, but he wasn't part of that hierarchy of demigods and angels and everything leading up to pure spiritual God. He's saying, no, the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And that's his point, because they developed that idea about Christ, and he's battling that to keep correcting. Good question.